Let's get right to our event. Before I begin, I want to thank a few people. Of course, I want to thank our speakers for their fantastic talks. Of course, Director of Carolina Public Humanities, Dr. Lloyd Kramer, our wonderful friend Freddie Kiger, and our new friend Suzanne Globetti. All have come together and given us excellent talks from 1800, 1860, and 1968, and we really look forward to getting back into those topics. I also want to thank, of course, all of our participants who came to the three talks and who are joining us tonight. So it's great to see you coming back and being interested in this continuing dialogue or quadralogue, if we will, about elections. And of course, our sponsors, the Cotton Merca Group and Morgan Stanley, Carolina Meadows, and our dear friends, the GAA, without whom I just mentioned tonight wouldn't even happen at all. But we've taken a little bit of time here, folks, getting everything set up, so we want to get right to it. And what I'm going to do is, of course, welcome and invite everyone to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen there to put questions forward, and I'll begin feeding them to the various panelists. You can ask questions of the whole panel or individual panelists if you would like. And while you're thinking of your questions and we're collecting them, I'm going to start out with just a little something I've been thinking about. I just want to say that, you know, all these talks vividly described how national elections polarized American citizens and came dangerously close to ending the Union in 1800 and really close in 1860, well, for 4 years, definitely, and 1968. And yet, interestingly, as I thought about that, each election you described had sort of non-binary choices for the citizens. And this division of standard binary blocks into subcategories seemed to exacerbate partisanship, interestingly enough. So my question is premised on the idea that polarization might be a normal and could in fact be a healthy aspect of democratic practice. And the question is, what do these complicated non-binary elections that you describe tell us about normative polarization, which might be predictable, and heightened partisan polarization that can be deadly to democratic functions? Where and what is the dividing line between a healthy polarized society and fatal partisan divides? And you could use your own particular election to talk about it or go in general. So I guess I would start chronologically with Dr. Kramer, and again, invite everyone to put your questions in the question and answer while they engage with this.
Well, I think one of the other striking aspects to these elections, it was that each polarized party also had splits within it. I mean, this was very striking. So the polarization was intensified. So just to take an example of the Federalists, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton hated each other, and they've essentially mobilized different sides of the party, which seemed to deepen the polarization. The Democratic Republicans, who had Burr and Jefferson, they were also divided in that Burr and Jefferson were not close, and this was by no means a collegial relationship. So there were two general parties, but I think the crisis becomes intensified when the parties, in effect, are almost like four parties. And you know, we may have something a little like that now. The Democratic Party in 2020 has two very clearly polarized wings that were represented in a sort of Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton competition. And the Republican Party, you know, there is still sort of a never Trump and a Trump faction. So I think that the polarization is part of all political life, and the great struggle of America has been to try to hold natural polarizations into two parties. And when that can't be done, the whole system begins to unravel.
Yes, thank you for that, Lloyd. Freddie, thoughts on that for 1860? Where is the dividing line between normal polarization and or healthy, and when it became partisan and fatal to the Union? Or was it too late in 1860?
Well, I will bow to my colleague, Dr. Kramer, and reinforce what indeed happened in 1860. You know, you had the second running of the Republican Party. You had the Democrats who split horribly into the Northern and Southern Democrats. Then you had the Constitutional Union Party representing the border states. So while we might think of polarization as one pole versus another pole, we had an instance of four parties representing geographical areas that certainly represented even more splintering to the polarization, if you will. At that particular time in the United States, you could pit New England versus the Deep South. And then you could get down into the lower North versus the Northern South. And in those areas, there was certainly great resolve to have difference of opinion. You know, too many people, Max, think of the monolithic South and of the monolithic North. Every Northerner was an abolitionist, every Southerner was a slave owner. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And that would be reinforced not only politically, but economically and militarily as the war progressed. So once again, it wasn't a clear polarization into two separate parties, but across the South, north to south in the southern part of the United States, and New England and the lower North also suffered drastically from splintering, which certainly yielded consequences that would essentially lead to American Civil War and to civil wars within civil wars when the conflict began.
Great, thank you for that. How does this notion of normative polarization, when it becomes non-normative and destructive, how does that work out in 1968, Dr. Lobetti? And I'll unmute you.
So it's a great question. And as Lloyd and Freddie were talking, I was just thinking lots of different elements to this question. So in 1968, it's interesting because, again, like you alluded to, and Freddie and Lloyd were talking about, in both of those elections and in 68, you do have this third, you have this third party candidate. You have all of this strife. What I think is kind of interesting about it is our system is set up really for two parties with a single member district. It just really is pretty much going to be the case that unless something were to change to completely reform our electoral system, we're not going to really have more than two parties. I mean, we have these third parties like George Wallace, we have Ross Perot, who got like 19% of the vote, but 0 electoral votes when he ran in 1992. So what you traditionally have are these two big parties that are supposed to be big tent parties, and they have to contain within them all of that strife. And so I think what you often see is that breaks. And so I think that's often a sign that you're at a stress point with the particular, system that you have. So in terms of normatively, I think normatively, what people would think is that third parties are good and that they should be, that they would be good for the system. What we typically have, though, is a third party candidate comes on the scene and does really well. And I've heard it referred to as the bee sting theory of third parties. So that like a bee, they come in, they sting, and then they die. So you look at what happened in 1972, and Wallace actually goes back to the Democratic Party and he runs within the Democratic Party instead of running. And he makes some comment that he wants to get away from third parties. They're like squirrels, there are too many nuts in them. And so I think that a problem we have is that we do have a two-party system that makes it very difficult to have a third party. And so because of that, that kind of heightens this competition within, and it makes it even more divisive. If we did have a system where third parties could get some type of representation, maybe in Congress, and make more of a coalition, we might have more compromise. But I think it's really difficult right now to see that.
Great, thank you for that. I want to just say it's James Evan had asked a question that you have answered about 90% of in that last little bit. So I'm going to read this question for you if there's any other thoughts you have on this. James asks, it seems like a two-party system stimulates polarization. Can you comment on A, whether this may be the case, B, why we evolved so quickly to a two-party system, and finally, C, whether you think the US could ever develop a multi-party system? Thanks, James Evans. I will start with you, Suzanne, but then of course invite Freddie and Lloyd to jump in on that question as well.
Well, I think the problem that we have is that our electoral system is based, the Constitution really doesn't say how we have to elect. We know that we have these that the states have certain, numbers of congressional seats, and we know there has to be a census and that has to be developed. But really, a lot of our electoral laws are up to the states. They're not federally decided upon. And so who controls the state legislatures are currently people in office who are Democrats and Republicans, and they want to stay in office. And so it's very challenging for them to, it's difficult to see them making laws. Again, we talked a little bit about this last night. Their personal incentives are at odds maybe with what the collective and collective interest might be. So I think it is very tough to have a third party. I do say too, we look at sort of this placid time. We might think of the 50s as really this placid time. So times, but at that time there was actually, just like we were talking about, there was a lot of strife within the parties. So we tend to see, with that division in the party, there's still polarization. It may just not be between the parties, but within. So.
Great, thank you. Thoughts? Yes, please, Freddie and Dr. Kramer, if you want to jump in on either of these comments about two-party systems.
Also, over the years with a third party, if they make a big enough splash, they usually do not last that particularly long, because the major parties adopt their main platform planks, their best ideas, and strip them of the momentum that they may have had they been able to develop. And that has happened repeatedly ever since the anti-Masons of the 1830s.
Lloyd, I'm curious about the way in the early republic, was it inevitable that it was a two-party system? Was this sort of the Roman influence of the optimates and populares and just the way people thought of politics? And you need to unmute if you could.
Okay, so I think that one of the flaws of the Constitution writers was that they did not think clearly about political parties. That's pretty obvious. I think the electoral college system really mitigates against third parties, and maybe they thought that there could be, people who are not part of a party who could be a viable presidential candidate. I think, well, first of all, the electoral college is a profoundly anti-democratic institution, but it does push toward a two-party system. The alternative would be proportional representation. And there are many societies in Europe and elsewhere that create an opening. So if you can get 5 or 10% of the vote, you get representation in the parliament or the legislative body. And I've often thought that does open the way to a lot more compromise, and that it's very hard for anybody to get an absolute majority. So you've got to create coalitions. But that also often freezes up a government. They take months to work out a coalition. They're all horse trading. So that's not really such a great option either. But I understand that it's more democratic, because that way everybody who votes, they hit a certain threshold, has at least somebody at the table. And in our system, there's no way to get to the table, really, unless you're in one of the two major parties.
Great. This brings us.
I do think that's a problem, but it's probably contributed to some of the long-term stability of the United States. When that doesn't work because the parties themselves are so fractured, then we have more polarization.
Great. We have a question here that touched on something, Lloyd, that I'm going to throw this to Freddie first, but let everyone weigh in on what impact. Jerry Everhart asked, what impact, if any, do you think the Electoral College has had on the political divisions we have heard about this week, or in the divisions we're having today? So I guess speaking to 1860, and then whatever else you'd like to say about the Electoral College, Freddie, and then we'll bounce it to our other speakers.
It's a great question, a great observation. The Electoral College in 1860, simply put, Lincoln carried 18 of the 33 states and even had the three candidates, Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell, amass their popular or electoral vote. They would not have been able to topple Mr. Lincoln's electoral majority. He had a majority of 57 and had certainly enough votes, 180, to be elected. That situation created definitely concerned for the Southern folks because they saw themselves a victim of the system. They saw themselves a victim of the democratic situation as it had been constitutionally placed. And that is one of the reasons why they had the added incentive to do exactly what they did. Of course, 11 states seceding. But I will say, and this is something that Suzanne brought up last evening, it was a great observation as to the retention of the system itself despite polarization. What did the Confederates do even after they seceded? Within literally weeks, they reinforced the very system from which they seceded by setting up a government, writing a constitution, and essentially writing a constitution that for all practical purposes was the very same as the United States Constitution, with several omissions and, of course, additions to suit their needs. So I always found it kind of interesting. You seceded so that you could create essentially the same animal that would cause problems during the war. As I mentioned during my talk, Southerners made lousy Confederates.
Great. Thank you for that. You know, I'm going to ask Suzanne for thoughts about the Electoral College in your election, but also I'm going to add James Evans asked, you mentioned that the Electoral College drives polarization. Can you comment on various current attempts to defang the Electoral College short of amending the Constitution and their prospects for success? So we're giving you double duty to kind of address 68 and then briefly sort of think about some of these other ideas that have been floated.
Yeah, so in 68, I think I mentioned last night, there was a real concern that George Wallace was popular enough and would win enough electoral votes that he would throw the election into the House of Representatives. And in fact, that was really his goal. He knew he wasn't going to win. He wanted to be a power broker, and so much so that he really didn't care about who he chose for his vice president. He didn't even want to choose a vice president. It was just something he thought was a task that was only going to be a headache. And he ended up choosing someone who was a very poor choice, who was apparently the Dr. Strangelove modeled a character on him, talked about using nuclear bombs all the time. So I think that that was a problem, that potential problem. But I do think that, and there was some talk of like a couple of states had switched, that we would have been in that situation. So in terms of reforming the Electoral College, I think it's a tough job, because the way that it would have to be done. So I don't know how familiar you are. I mean, first of all, amending the Constitution is very difficult. Mm-hmm. And what we would be asking for are states that are smaller states to give up some of their power. And we know, for example, that, a state like Wyoming has the same amount, it has this like disproportionate amount of power in the Electoral College. You also look at states like Pennsylvania, for example. I was listening, I don't know if you all watched the debate last night, a lot of questions about fracking. And someone made the point, if Pennsylvania wasn't a big battleground state in the Electoral College, this wouldn't be an issue. The Democrats would be saying we should ban fracking. And so you see these particular things, and there's actually political science research that suggests that more federal money goes to the battleground states than the other states, and that takes into account population. So we're seeing this kind of doling out. So I guess to answer your question, that it's unlikely, the way that it's very unlikely to get an amendment through, because, well, even if it passed, it has to be ratified by the states, and we're looking at 3/4 of the states. That's very, very difficult. Second idea is this National Voter Compact, I believe, where you have a certain number of states sign on and say, okay, well, if this candidate wins the popular vote, then we're going to give all our electoral votes to that candidate. That's a movement that a lot of states have signed on to. Mm-hmm. I don't know, how, but not enough to make it, where it would matter. The third thing would be states to move to the way that Nebraska and Maine do it, which is not a winner-take-all system, and that would be again state legislatures choosing that. I just think all of them, to be honest, are unlikely because of how difficult it is to make changes based on our Constitution.
Great, thank you for that. Lloyd, you know, you had started, you were the first to mention the Electoral College when you were talking about the founding fathers. And you also mentioned that they didn't foresee political parties. And this brings up our friend Abby writes, you know, I think we are missing a point. At several points in our history, we have seen the rise and fall of parties. The Whigs collapsed in favor of the Republicans. That's the statement Abby gives us. So I'll maybe put that in a question. If the norm is a polarized two-party system, how do new parties arise and coalesce and end up sort of taking the place in these polarized ideas? And what can you speak about in terms of the founding fathers and what they might have thought of parties in this context, or just in general?
Well, I saw Freddie had his hand up. I don't know if you wanted to say something else about.
Oh, please, yeah.
Well, if I may just make one little observation, this will be our 59th presidential election. In 53, the candidate with the most popular votes won the Electoral College vote, and none but one thus far has ever triggered civil war. And so I was making that reference with the Electoral College as it related to 1860. But Dr. Kramer, thank you very much, Lloyd, for allowing me to step on stage for a second. I yield, if you will, to you, sir.
We like crosstalk. It's only difficult to do on Zoom. Jump in at any time, please.
All right. Thank you.
So I wanted to say one other thing about the Electoral College. Two of the last three presidents have been selected without winning the popular vote. I'm thinking about George Bush in 2000 and of course Trump in 2016. I personally think that the system will buckle and fall if this becomes a pattern over the next 50 years, that repeatedly this happens. Freddie just pointed out that it's very rare, but it may be becoming more common.
Right.
And if there is this profound disconnect between the popular vote and who gets into office, I think we're going to have some kind of real crisis, just as in the late Roman Republic, it began to break down because people felt they weren't represented. Now the other question, though, about what creates new parties. Clearly, the Federalist Party fell apart and lost its role in political life because it represented a position that was no longer viable, especially after the War of 1812. So the Whigs came out of that, and then that party dissolved.
Over slavery. We
haven't had then a complete dissolution of the parties, but we had, in effect, a complete reformulation of the parties, as Freddie pointed out, and Suzanne as well. You know, the Republican Party basically flipped into the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party, if you look at where its strengths are, what its platform is, it's an amazing transformation. So the two parties are now exactly almost opposite of what they were in 1860.
Exactly.
I do think because of the way the two-party system works, if there were a third party to be created, it would have to generate a huge amount of support to become viable very quickly. And as Freddie has very wisely pointed out, often when the major parties see that a popular position is being advocated by a third party, they pick it up themselves. So in effect, the parties are transformed now without actually creating a new party. And that's what's happened to both parties.
Great. I'm going to see, thank you for that. I think wonderful thoughts all around. I'm going to see if I can combine two questions here from an anonymous attendee and Jane. So the anonymous attendee asked, religious beliefs seem to have had a profound effect on all these elections. Is this unique to American democracy? And Jane asked, we have seen a general social liberalization in American public opinion over the past 50 years. I'm going to say past 150 years or 170 years if we consider abolition as a movement of social liberalization. So how do we understand the movement towards more radical right perspectives against the backdrop of this larger social liberalization? Is it largely explained by increasing disconnect between the online media reality and actual day-to-day reality of most people's lives? The end of that question is fairly contemporary, but I think what we can address the contemporary in that question by also looking at some of the historical examples of moral issues and new issues coming on board and the retrenchment of the right. So address that however you would, and I'll let anyone who wants to step on that double question first.
Well, I do think that moral and religious issues have often been more significant in American politics than in some countries. You know, that took different forms, like the Prohibition movement, for example, was a very powerful political movement that finally, in effect, seized political power, you know, and passed the amendment to ban alcohol. That was a very moral and religious movement, as was abolitionism. So many of the political campaigns have had a religious component to it. But I don't think that in the end, so far, that we've literally divided on religious grounds. And that did happen in, you know, Northern Ireland, for example, Ireland, or in parts of France at different periods with Protestants and Catholics, or certainly during the 30 Years' War in Germany. So we have never gotten to the point where religion was the absolute political demarcation that it has been in some societies. On the other hand, moral issues often surface in American politics more vehemently than they do in other societies. So it's both, I think.
I agree. They're talking about how they have, I wouldn't say like religious, particular religion per se, but this moral element to them. So if you look at the vote now and you see there's a really big divide if you look at like church attenders versus non-church attenders. So you know, seculars, if you want to go with that term, that is a divide that's becoming increasingly if you break down by the parties. But I do think it's not like a particular religious identification, it's just religiosity. And I think it's more captured by sort of a moral traditionalism. So what I would say is, it is interesting because we do see this kind of move, and I kind of see this as a backlash, as in a way, and a trying to hold on to the common, so, you know, this kind of traditional way. So we saw that in 1968, the idea that times are changing and it feels threatening. So there's been a lot of work done that suggests now one of the biggest divides is in a worldview that people have. So do they feel open to new ideas? Do they feel open to like a new society, or do they feel frightened, threatened by that and then retrench? And so you can kind of line a lot of these issues up. Immigration, for example. And some people would say that's just, you know, people are just being, you know, xenophobic. But I think it's along these lines of being threatened by others or by, you know, new things. And that's not a religious thing per se. That's just more of a traditionalism, I think, where religion is definitely part of that.
Ready?
I'm thinking again back to the 1860s, and I think of the American Party and the know-nothings and the xenophobia that reigned and drove that particular party until it passed out of existence to some degree in the 1850s. And then again, I think about the abolitionism with a moral cause to end the hateful institution of slavery. However, when we look at the number of abolitionists at that particular time, it was not significant. I'm not sure if we in 2020, if we had the ability to go back to 1860 and to watch and to witness and experience how life was at that particular time in our nation's development, I'm not sure any of us would be too very proud about the ethnic and cultural prejudices that by and large this nation held. I don't think slavery at that particular time was a driving issue as far even as keeping it from extending into the territories was morally driven. It was for a few, for the large part up in New England, where religion has been and morality has been so much a part of their colonial and early state history. It was more economics. And I would almost wager to say that while religion and morals certainly enter the fray, for most Americans, and I'll throw this to Lloyd and to Suzanne, are we not still talking many instances for every election that one's pocketbook is the most driving element as to whom someone is going to vote for?
I think that's right, but there are always people with a very passionate religious point of view. And I think I mean, the parallel, I mentioned prohibitionism, which prohibitionists were a very powerful moral and religious movement. And they eventually won, in a sense, but their very victory led to their permanent defeat. And I sometimes wonder if abortion isn't the issue of, you know, in the last 50 years, abortion has been the issue like prohibition was. There is a sector of the society that wants to stop it altogether. And they may be on the point of prevailing in the Supreme Court even.
Exactly.
But my guess would be that just as with prohibition, that victory would in the long run lead to a reaction that would defeat that position. And I think that, so whenever you get a religious movement like that, they can have great influence, but they have a hard time sustaining it. And in fact, the abolitionists had the same problem. They won the Civil War, but the point you made was exactly that. The abolitionists weren't able to prevail even during Reconstruction, let alone beyond that.
Correct.
Thank you for that. Paul Connick has a few questions here. First thing he wrote, and I have another question about proportionate representation that I'm going to ask in a few minutes from one of our attendees. Paul just wanted everyone to note that Lainey Garnier, I don't know how to pronounce that, wrote in favor of proportionate representation, was raked over the coals for it, the result being her withdrawal as a candidate for Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. So thank you for that, for that piece of knowledge. But Paul, I'm going to get to your question. I'm going to try to combine your two questions here. Paul writes, this discussion is thus far centered on divisions between and within political parties. Is this putting the cart before the horse? Can you speak to the divisions within US society that can appear so deep and irresolvable as to lead one to wonder whether we live in two separate countries? I'll just do that one question now.
Does anybody want to jump into how many countries we actually have here? It is an amazing thing. Let me just say, I am sometimes just absolutely amazed that so many different kinds of people all live in this society in a relatively peaceful and manageable way. I think this is an amazing achievement, actually. And that's been one of my, this is where my pride in the American achievement comes out. It's like this multicultural, multi-religious experiment is pretty amazing. And it didn't always work so well in Europe, you know, where ethnic nationalism was much more powerful. So I have been concerned with the rise of a kind of ethnic nationalism in recent years, a return to what Freddie described in the 1850s with the Know Nothing Party, that there is a strand in American society that wants to purify and make us one thing. It's a typical nationalist ideology. But the great achievement of America has always been, what is it, e pluribus unum, that we have an amazing diversity and yet held together by an ideology of civic participation and capitalism, I would say, you know, get rich.
It's remarkable how much politics do make people aware of their partisan identity, that you could go and have be at a football game and everybody cheering for the Tar Heels and have this wonderful communal feeling, or at a backyard barbecue or at a music event or wherever. But when you give the political voice, that's when we really, it's pretty divisive. Politics are terrible. Freddie, any thoughts on this, please?
Please go ahead, Suzanne.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because it's always a question of, is the public leading elites, or elites leading the public? And it's really, I think there's always public input, but I think that what elites do shapes a lot. So when we think about today, it is amazing to me when we talk about two different countries, just the way an event will happen, and it will be interpreted in such different ways and so passionately. So I think, and it's not just politics, right? It's everything now. So it's sports, it's the NFL, it's kneeling, and one side sees it one way and one side sees it very much the other. It's wearing a mask. You know, is that something you should do or not? And so I think that the public, I think the parties, I think it's an excellent question, right? That if people didn't have division, then they wouldn't have electoral gain by exploiting it. I think part of it is the parties have become so much a part of our social identity now. And so when a party becomes part of your social identity, then you really you are completely motivated by your motivated reasoning. Every decision you make, evaluation you make, goes back to this idea of what party you have and not wanting to have this cognitive dissonance of thinking differently about your beliefs and the party. So even when we're talking about economics, what they're finding now, and economics are always very important, you're exactly right, but that people's view of the economic situation is very colored now by their party. So we have the same economy, but we see that Republicans see it as great, and we see the Democrats see it as terrible, even though they're experiencing the exact same thing with coronavirus. And it's not materially that different for them. The Republicans are saying coronavirus isn't a threat. It's fine. It's no problem. The Democrats are saying the opposite. So I do think that it's definitely, if we didn't feel division, if it couldn't be exploited for whatever reason, I think that politicians wouldn't stress this. But I think that sadly there are incentives to doing it, and I think that you see it all the time, in tweets and comments. You see it. So I don't mean to be so negative about our current situation, but it's pretty depressing, I think.
Well, like I said, I'm holding questions, trying to go chronologically. Believe me, we got a lot coming up for contemporary comments. But Freddie, thoughts on this idea of society or politics first?
Well, as far as society and politics, in the next 30 or 40 different years in which Lloyd and Suzanne have touched on this is not our grandfather's America. This is going to be a very diverse country. If we always thought of ourselves as the melting pot, wow, are we a smorgasbord in the next 30, 40, or 50 years? The quilt is going to become even more complex. And as that occurs in society and culturally, there is always going to be one segment of the population, and I'll go back to 1860 with Lincoln's candidacy and his stating, I will not allow slavery to expand. And many Southern slaveholders are thinking that's just one more domino that's going to eventually abolish my lifestyle. We have folks today who maybe they're consciously aware of how this nation is changing as far as its societal makeup and its cultural makeup, but they feel threatened. And by feeling threatened, they may vote and act and demonstrate in more extreme measures than we might normally have experienced in years past. And like Suzanne, I too am very concerned about where we are, and with so many segments of our population who fear this change that is coming about that they think threatens them politically, economically, socially, culturally.
Well, thank you, Fred. I wish these topics would just sort of lead us to a happy place all the time. but alas, it's important, and we're all living through it. I'm gonna.
Could I just say one last thing about culture?
Yeah.
When people study European history, they often note the economic element and the power of socialism and ideologies like that, in which people define themselves more by their position in the economic and social hierarchy. And Americans always had this idea, we could call it a mythological aspiration, that anyone can become a millionaire anytime. If things break the right way, that's going to be me.
That's why I went into the humanities, right?
But that means that cultural and religious and maybe even racial identities take on more power if you don't define people as much in terms of economic and social class, which was a much stronger tradition in European society.
That makes great sense. I have a few sort of detailed questions that I think would make for some really interesting answers. I guess I'll start out with, has the census been, this is Tim White, has the census been a political football in the past as much as Trump is attempting by cutting off the count early? Other examples from the past, or maybe from the founding fathers, where does the census fall into this? Happens every 10 years. Was it predicted to be a political football?
Well, let me just say about 1790 to 1800. It was incredibly politicized because from what I talked about in the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, who's counting these enslaved people in southern agricultural regions? How is that being padded or not padded here and there? And, you know, it gave the South an incredible political power because of the way the census was set up to count people who couldn't vote. You know, this is one of the arguments, again, about structural racism, but if you've got a system that is manipulating census numbers on the basis of race, that's extremely politicized. And it happened all through the antebellum period. A lot of suspicion about the census. Fred probably knows more about that than I do, but I know there was concern about it from the very beginning.
Thank you for that. Let's get to a question from Nils Brubaker. Maybe Freddie, with your experience of American history, why haven't any states in the U.S. tried a different form of government? This gets back to parliamentary or proportional representation in their legislature. Is it because we copied the British system of single representative districts? Do we know anything about state legislatures and attempts to move away from the way that our system works in the federal?
Well, I will have to claim, Niels, thank you. That's a great question, but I yield to my colleagues on this one.
Okay.
Doesn't Nebraska have a unicameral legislature, for example?
They do. They're the only state that does.
And this is one of the other claims that was made early on. For example, at the time of the French Revolution, when they created the National Assembly, people said if you create an upper house, you're going to have an anti-democratic system because you're always going to have a reactionary group that can restrain social progress, political progress. So they had a single house, you know, and this has been one of the issues in American society. You always have dual legislative houses. And to come back to 1800, because of the electoral college struggle in Pennsylvania, the upper house was controlled by the Federalists, the lower house by the Democratic Republicans. And it was so contentious that they couldn't agree on electoral college delegates, you know, representatives. So that's why Pennsylvania split 8-7. But no one ever, well, Pennsylvania had earlier had a unicameral legislature, which had been changed, I believe, in the 1780s. That's been the most digression from the standard model of any state system that I know of. But no one has ever gone to proportional representation. Have they, Suzanne? Has anybody ever tried that?
I believe there may be, and I don't know, there may be a few cities that have town councils that are proportional. And I want to say, it's some West Coast city. I'm not exactly sure. I believe that there, maybe Cambridge, Massachusetts is one, actually. I'm not sure. I think Cambridge may be, so don't quote me, but I've seen scattered 1 or 2 towns that have done that. Certainly not the states. They haven't done that. There are a couple of other things that the states have experimented with. I believe that ranked choice voting is on the ballot in Maine this year, for example. And so that's something that people often talk about. So that would help with your balloting. And one reason people won't vote for third parties because they don't want to spoil their vote, waste their vote. So a couple of places now have started ranked choice voting, and I believe Maine statewide, but I know a couple other places do that. And then there are a couple states, California, their primary system is different for their statewide races, where everyone is in the primary and then they take the top 2 and they're against each other. So that's another way to try and moderate the people who are running. But yeah, I haven't seen anything in terms of like proportional representation or anything like that at the state level, just sort of some electoral differences.
Great, thank you for that.
One thing we are seeing at some states, the attempt to create nonpartisan commissions to create congressional districts and try to fight the gerrymandering problem. And that has developed in some states. Yeah. And that could have a huge impact going forward in terms of creating a more balanced political outcome.
Just out of curiosity, Freddie, in the Confederacy, did they have a census or anything? They were too busy conducting a war. You know, how did they think about these issues in the Confederate Constitution, which you said pretty much mirrors our Constitution?
There may have been an idea for a Confederate census, but within a year and a half, the Confederacy was falling, if you will, on all points.
Numbers going down.
It was a survival mode to try to do such. Now, you know, there was one constitutional change. Jefferson Davis did serve a 6-year term as opposed to a 4-year term, and it was non-repeating. So there was one fundamental change, and of course, slavery was expressly protected. There was an interesting element in the Confederate Constitution as well, that you as a Southern state could not secede from the Confederacy.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Exactly, which of course Western Virginia picked up the white glove and took care of that. But that could only take place because militarily it had been held and was within the Union fold, becoming a new state in June of 1863. I will say too that constitutionally, although there were 3 branches in the Confederacy never established a Supreme Court of any strength, of any effect or prowess during its limited 4 or 5 years of creation.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to combine 2 questions here for Dr. Globetti, and of course I welcome our other panelists to jump in. James Gray asked Dr. Globetti, in '68 you listed Vietnam, race, and law and order as the 3 key issues. Could you substitute COVID for Vietnam since it has spawned deaths and division? Race and law and order remain number 2 and 3, I think. And the reason I'm combining it with this anonymous question is, Dr. Globetti, you mentioned Lee Atwater's plan to reframe the issues of 1968 to be more acceptable than racist. Do you see current examples of politicians reframing voters' fears to be more acceptable? And that's, of course, an invitation to any panelist to weigh in. But Dr. Globetti, would you like to start with that?
That's a great question. I think that is a really good insight. So we could say COVID. So one thing about Vietnam is it sort of reordered things in terms of people who wanted to have diplomacy maybe versus aggressive force, and those people, you know, that's a division you always have. But of course, Vietnam, that conflict was settled, so it's no longer with us. And COVID is the same sort of very intense and important for this election cycle, but for the next election cycle, well, let's hope by the next 4 years that it won't have the same impact. So I think that is good. I also think that, like in 1968, the response to COVID is also breaking down among these lines that are, you know, we're looking at states having these rallies to reopen the state, right? And you can't tell me to wear a mask, and you're taking away my freedom. And so you're seeing the COVID response. And there's some really fascinating research about Democrats and Republicans seeing it different, not just in terms of the president, how he's doing, but in terms of the threat and even the number of lives that were acceptable to be lost. And so they asked how many people have died. And I think 57% of Republicans said that was, that was an acceptable number. That was okay. And the Democrats didn't see it that way. And, obviously that has to do because who's going to be blamed for it. But I think that that's a really good thing because it also touches into that cultural aspect. And secondly, about Atwater, I think when I was preparing this, just hearing again, the law and order, Trump talking about, tweeting about, not just law and order, there's this new discussion about the suburbs. So if you go back and look, the suburban, I think Trump sent out a tweet that said suburban women of America, where there's this housing bill and these low income people are going to come in. And I think it was just yesterday that he tweeted something out. Mm-hmm. And so, and it was very interesting. So I think that we definitely are saying law and order, silent majority, which someone asked about yesterday. But I also think it's not just implicit a lot now. I think those were code words then. I don't know that they're code words now almost. Like I think people know what those, mm-hmm. I think it's becoming even more explicit, I guess is what I'm trying to say, than that. And the whole Charlottesville, I just think that it's gone a little bit in the direction of more explicit.
It seems like dog whistle is a special idea, that there is a notion of decency in society that you can't speak directly to. And I imagine back in the days Freddie is talking about, and even in the days that Lloyd is talking about, people didn't have such, worrying too much about what they said. Very interesting. Let me I want to make sure we can get to all the questions that have been asked. And again, many of them are going to bring us right to have you comment on contemporary politics. We don't offer our political opinions at all, but many of our attendees have. So I'll read their questions. But let's get to a few more of the historical ones. And I love this one from Carol. As contrast, what might have been 2 or 3 least polarized elections, and what might be learned from the contrast? Are there good elections in which everybody just got along?
Well, I think 1816 was fairly united, and but I don't think anybody remembers much about it because of that reason. I don't know, Freddie, are there some that are so dull that no one fights over anything?
I guess you don't learn anything from them if nobody fought over them, right?
Well, in the election of 1820, in the midst of the era of good feeling, when James Monroe essentially ran unopposed and would have received every electoral vote save one, who did not want George Washington to share that honor of being electorally elected unanimously. What essentially was going on in 1820 was a factor where there was just low ebbs of polarizing politics. And so if I were to think of one particular election that was perhaps sunshine, lollipop, and roses, may have been 1820. But I will also say that in the next 2 elections, particularly in 1824, there was massive fragmentation in which you had William Crawford from Georgia representing the Southeast, Henry Clay, the West, Andrew Jackson, the Southwest, and John Quincy Adams representing the Northeast. So the absence of political antagonism or other parties eventually led to fragmentation and geographical parties, if you will.
Great, thank you for that. I have a question here, getting to one of our historical questions. Again, we are coming up on 6:27. I'm going to, of course, go a few minutes over if it's okay with Freddie and Suzanne and Lloyd, because of my mess up in the beginning, but we'll try to answer all of these questions. And this one, I guess we'll start with Suzanne. Please comment on the effort by Senator Birch Bayh in 1970 to amend the Constitution to abolish the Electoral College. And that's from Eva Walker.
I'm not really aware of that particular. I know that the process to amend the Constitution, it would need to pass both houses in Congress, and then be sent by 2/3 in both houses, and then be sent out and be ratified by 3/4 of the state conventions or state legislatures. So I am not aware of that having gotten very far. I do know that he is one of the more considered, one of the kind of statesmen, senators of the time, and so not particularly polarizing. So I'm not sure. I definitely have to look into that to see, but I think it's very interesting.
So I read something about this recently, that it actually went a long way toward being accepted, and a group of Southern senators intervened and stopped it. That is, they could filibuster it, and they stopped it. And I don't know if it was Eastland of Mississippi or Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, but this was precisely for the fear, just as we could see in 1800 or 1860, that the abolition of the Electoral College would work to the disadvantage of certain Southern states and the concerns of people in those states who were worried about federal intervention coming out of the civil rights movement. But I don't know the details of that, but it is a period of constitutional reform or electoral change, because as you mentioned last night, by 1972, was it, that 18-year-olds got the right to vote?
Yeah.
That was a big thing, I mean, and apart from coming out of the civil rights movement and voting rights, the idea that if you were old enough to serve, you were old enough to vote. That was sort of the idea. I think the early 70s were as close as we ever got to getting rid of the Electoral College. And now there's such a built-in recognition, especially in the Republican Party, that it's essential for protection of their interests. I can't see how it can change. That's why I'm really concerned about the long-term health of the democratic process in the United States. I think the Electoral College is a major threat.
Thank you for that. Yes, please, Freddie.
And it is a political football. As long as it has the potential of working for one particular party or the other, they're going to embrace it. And that would require, much like Franklin Roosevelt trying to pack the court, anytime you start tinkering with the Constitution and going to those principles and those basics, there is a significant portion of the American public, whether they understand it completely or not, that resists that kind of fundamental change.
For sure. I have, thank you for that, Freddie. I have a question here. It's two questions, one from Candy Lavender and the other from John Sosby. And they're about contemporary issues, but I'm going to start with Freddie if I could and think, Candy asked, can you talk about the role of media and in particular social media in the polarization of the 2020s election? And John Sosby asks, how will the role of conservative opinion and news media be remembered by future historians? Is it a cause of our polarization or a symptom? Can it be both? Now, Freddie, it's an odd question for me to start with you, but I am curious about one thing. And I'm curious about the difference between the way news functioned. By this time, we have Telegram, and we have the ability to have a lot more contact with instant news than we did in the 1800s. So feel free to jump into the contemporary aspect of that, but I'm curious about news in the 1860s, and then you can go and talk about social media today and its effect, and conservative news and conservative media today.
Well, there was no question, Max, that, and as Lloyd can attest to this, newspapers were essentially the printed organs of political candidates. Certain newspapers rallied around a Jefferson or a Clay or what have you, and they became their printing press for their campaign, for their candidacy. The Telegraph helped with that, but there is no question that it did have an impact, particularly when you could make a speech, as Lincoln did at the Cooper Union Address in New York City, and have that speech broadcast across the country via the telegraph and through printed press. It had its effect, definitely. Today, my goodness, I can't begin to think all the fragmentation and all the opinions, Instagram and Facebook, where, like in my other world with sports broadcasting, journalism is now so-and-so just scored. There's no editorial, there's no facts, there's no analysis, there's no research. We have empowered bloggers to make statements, and then we're left to judge whether they know what they're talking about.
It will be an interesting thing to be the historian 100 years from now, won't it?
Oh my gosh.
Dr. Globetti, Dr. Kramer, thoughts on the role of social media in polarization today, and also maybe how do we make sense of conservative media and its role in particular?
I think that, I do think that it is something that is important. I think it's fueling a lot of what's going on. There's been some research on it that suggests that the effect that like conservative media has is that, in particular, well, any kind of polarized like partisan media like Fox or MSNBC, is that it takes people who are already conservative and makes them more conservative. It doesn't take someone who's moderate and make them extreme, but you have to think about who tunes in to Fox or MSNBC. it's a selection issue, right? People who watch are usually fans. They're not people who are going for a particular type of information. But what I think it does, and social media is the same. For example, Twitter, we talk about Twitter all the time, but they've done research that suggests that a very small percentage of people do, like 10% of people make 80% of the political tweets or something like that. It's some crazy figure like that. I may have that, but anyway, it's just a small sliver. And so people will say, listen, if you're listening to Twitter, you're getting this distorted view. But who listens to Twitter? It's politically engaged, it's office holders, it's the media. So even if ordinary people aren't consuming the social media, they're affected by it because it's influencing elites and it's making them, same thing with Fox News. I mean, we know that the president watches Fox News, he tweets about it. And so there's this loop going on now between this. And I think that that's something that it definitely feeds into it. And I should add, another problem it feeds into is misinformation, and especially with Facebook. And so what we're having is, people choose their own media, they choose their own facts, and that makes it harder and harder.
Lloyd, thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that when you really read the newspapers from the late 1790s, you realize that there was just as much fanatical attack on the other side as there is today. It was in the newspapers. And I mentioned a few of those. This is why the Federalists passed the sedition law, because these newspapers were seen as promoting, they called it false news. I guess we'd call it fake news now. It was highly, highly polarized, the press was. The difference today is the way it lands instantaneously on people's telephones and on their computers. And it intensifies, I think, and also the images that come with it. I think it intensifies the sense of urgency or the sense of threat, the sense of danger, and it amplifies conspiracy theories. And we are really awash in conspiracy theories again. And I think that's a dangerous moment as well.
It certainly makes for immediate reactivity, right? That happens, and it's a mass reactivity that creates this feedback loop that Suzanne.
And an instant response. I mean, if you read something in a newspaper, even if you wrote a letter to the editor, it would take quite a while.
Look, the fly landed on the vice president's head, and I went to go make a statement about it on Facebook, and I was late, and I was within seconds.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's instantaneous, and not just a few people, but thousands,
exactly.
millions of people.
Yeah. I'm not that original. Okay, we do have to close it up here very soon because we're going a little bit over. I do want to make sure that we can get to our questions here. Paul Connick, I'm going to start with Paul's first question and sort of leave it out there as a statement and then go to the second question if I could. Paul writes, isn't one of the problems we are experiencing that the Republican Party is not a Big Ten party? So-called never-Trumpers have either voluntarily left the party or been totally marginalized and silenced within it. I think we all can agree with that, and I'll let you address that if you want, but let me ask a more substantive question, not that wasn't substantive, Paul. Professor Globetti has spoken of motivated reasoning and the role of cognitive bias. Can you expand upon differences in cognitive or epistemic style as a source of polarization? In other words, the effect of the stark differences in how people think as well as in what they think. For example, the antagonisms that arise between those who guide their behavior in this pandemic by divine will or intercession, by revelation or divine will or intercession versus those who follow science.
So I think that's a good question. So there definitely is research to suggest that part of the difference between liberals and conservatives is in their cognitive style. So people have studied this and they've found that conservatives tend to want closure. They're uncomfortable with ambiguity. They don't like gray and they don't want like shades of gray. They like black and white. And so this need for cognitive closure is actually something that has been identified and I think plays a role here. I think that it's just something that is going to affect how you view things and also your levels of order. You're going to want order. If you're afraid of this anxiety with what's going on, you're going to kind of turn to something that you think is going to bring this order. So I think that that's definitely part of it and there has been evidence to suggest that conservatives are more prone to believing conspiracy theories. And again, that's a cognitive thing. That's not to say that liberals don't. There's certainly been a lot of conspiracy theories about Trump never having had COVID, for example, and that being all a hoax, you know. So I think that there are on both sides, but I think you're really onto something. And I think it feeds into the entire sort of difference in worldview, is this need for closure, this need for certainty, and what does that mean in terms of people's thinking about things and then their positions ultimately.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. Thoughts?
No, there was the famous study of the authoritarian personality when the psychology, well, people like Adorno in the Frankfurt School after around World War II, trying to understand the attraction to fascism. But there can be authoritarian personalities on all sides of the political spectrum. And, you know, we see that where people can't tolerate ambiguity. And I think that's the issue.
We did indeed have a dictator seminar recently, didn't we, where we looked at a few different sides of the authoritarian character.
Yeah, it comes in different directions, and you know, your garden variety Bolshevik could give a run for the money with a good fascist, I think, on that score.
I also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Please.
No, it just, and it's something else I thought of whenever Lloyd brought up the authoritarian personality, is there's a lot of research done on personality and ideology as well, and with the big five personality characteristics. So we're talking about openness and agreeable and conscientiousness and extroversion, introversion, and neuroticism. And their findings are, you know, fairly strong that openness to experience is predictive of ideology, and people who are more open to experience tend to be liberals. And then conscientiousness, people who are more conscientious tend to be conservative. And those are all done by survey measures, which ask various questions to measure that. So you can quibble with that, but I think that goes into that personality and that kind of thinking style too.
Certainly your colleagues, Jonathan Weiler and Mark Hetherington's work on, you know, Prius or pickup, looking at these ideas of how we're even raised affects the way that we might have political ideologies to the right or the left. Freddie, last thoughts on cognitive biases or the underlying mysteries of the human brain in our political lives?
I'm happy just to have 2 or 3 clear thoughts during the day.
Well, that's a fantastic way to end that. I'm going to, I don't know how to ask this question because I'm not sure if it's a conspiracy question or not. I don't think it is, from our dear friend Bob Kuykendall, who asked, is the group trying to prepare us for a civil war, riots outside the Democratic Convention, or duels to the death by major politicians? Because the word is group. I'm afraid it might be a conspiracy group. I'm not sure what that is, but I'm just going to leave it at, I hope none of those things happen. And I do hope that we have an election that resolves itself unambiguously and is supported by all United States citizens and accepted as a legitimate outcome of our civic life.
Is he suggesting that duels have been, well, we know the Vice President of the United States fought a duel with the former Secretary of the Treasury in 1804. So we might think things are bad now, but you know, if last night they had a debate, but I don't think Mike Pence said now we need to have a duel outside.
The one the week before got a little closer to the duel. All right, well, I don't want to keep our panelists anymore, and I don't want to keep our attendees. Thank you so much for everyone for coming to this wonderful seminar. First of all, I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Lloyd Kramer, Freddie Kiger, Dr. Suzanne Globetti. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for your wonderful talks. We hope to work with you all again. I also want to thank all of our attendees for coming and for asking your excellent questions. And I still see some coming up this. I'm going to have to maybe forward them to our attendees, to our panelists, and maybe they'll be able to answer them because we're out of time tonight. Please thank our sponsors, Cotton Merker Group and Morgan Stanley, Carolina Meadows, and our dear friends at the General Alumni Association, without which we wouldn't even be here because we're using their webinar ticket, whatever that means. And I just learned what that means tonight. So one more time, Lloyd, thank you.
Thank you, Max. And thanks to everybody who's been part of this seminar, wherever you may be.
Freddie, thank you.
Thank you, Max, and continue the great work, you and Lloyd. And it's been a pleasure to be teamed with Lloyd and with Suzanne. Thank you.
Great. And Dr. Globetti, thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it so much. It's been great. Thank you.
Well, we hope to see you and our panelists and all of our attendees, hopefully at a live event before too long. But regardless, you know where to find us, humanities.unc.edu. We thank you for joining us for this week's seminar on elections, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.